changing your life one story at a time. This is the Chicken Soup for the Soul podcast with Editor-in-Chief Amy Newmark.
Hey, it's Amy Newmark with your daily dose of Chicken Soup for the Soul inspiration to make you simply happy. In my book called Simply Happy, I talk about what may be the most important resolution of all, and that is to go easier on yourself. I have a chapter in the book called Meet Your Biggest Critic, because that little voice in your head is your worst enemy. So if you're one of those perfectionist, type A, striving for excellence type people like me, this is one of those umbrella changes that you might need to make before you can do anything else. This change needs to overlay everything. So here it is. Go easier on yourself. Be less of a perfectionist, less judgmental about your own weaknesses. And most importantly, don't be so critical of your own performance. Stop listening to that negative little voice inside your own head. So tell me if this sounds like you. You're doing something beautifully, as well as anyone on the planet could do it, but you still feel like you're pretending, that you're not qualified to do this magnificent thing that you're already doing. There's something that psychologists call imposter syndrome, and it's pretty common in busy, successful people, especially women. It happens when you start wondering when the rest of the world will realize that you don't know what you're doing. It happens to me on occasion because I'm always trying to do new things, and I bet it happens to you too. When you're doing your normal, awesome things, or when you try something new. It can even happen when you're doing a routine thing, such as watching your kids. I experienced imposter syndrome doing just that, watching my kids about 25 years ago. And I still remember it vividly. It had such an impact on me. My husband and I had gone to our neighbor's house for a barbecue, and we were with our two young children who were both still toddlers. And my husband had to leave halfway through the afternoon to go on a business trip, so I stayed on with the kids. And then as I was walking them back to the car after the barbecue, they looked up at me with those little trusting faces, confident they were in good hands. And I don't know what came over me, but I was suddenly hit with a massive wave of insecurity, and that negative little voice in my head was saying, "You're not really a grown-up. You're barely out of college." But I had these two little people depending on me, and there were two of them and only one me, and they thought I knew what I was doing. But that little voice was saying to me, "How can you possibly take care of them?" But there was nothing else to do. I did my best to ignore that little voice, and I drove home, got the kids out of their car seats and into the house, and then I made my way through dinner and baths and bedtime. And that whole time I was pretending that I was their all-knowing, competent mother instead of the just-out-of-college kid that I felt like. But it worked, and the actual kids were none the wiser, and I've just never forgotten that feeling. And we get a lot of stories about that negative little voice in our heads. One story that had an impact on me was called Battling My Inner Bully, and it was in Chicken Soup for the Soul, The Power of Positive. Sarah Matson, who wrote it, describes how, even in grade school, her inner bully was much worse than any bully she encountered in class. She says, "I grew up lacking self-confidence, even though outwardly I was a high achiever. I excelled in school, earned a full scholarship to college, graduated magna cum laude, and became a world-traveling teacher. But I couldn't fully enjoy those accomplishments because always underneath was the feeling that I wasn't good enough." Eventually, as an adult, Sarah went to a therapist to figure out why she couldn't quiet that negative little voice in her head. And she still couldn't figure out how to overcome that voice until she was diagnosed with an autoimmune disease. And then one day she was explaining her autoimmune disease to her therapist and how her white blood cells were attacking her own body. And suddenly it struck her. "That's funny," she said. "I just realized that's what I do. I attack my own self." So that epiphany changed her. And on her 40th birthday, she made a resolution. She wrote in her journal, "This year, I want to be kind to myself." She says it's been hard work, but she has learned to talk back to that little voice in her head. And there's a quote about this that I love from an author named Sally Kempton. Sally says, it's hard to fight an enemy who has outposts in your head. And that's the point of this episode of the Chicken Soup for the Soul podcast. Before we conquer the world, we have to conquer our own negative little voices. So go easy on yourself in this new year. Stop judging yourself more harshly than you judge the rest of the world. Tomorrow is Tip Tuesday, and we're going to talk about something else that you can do that is very powerful. And that is to carry yourself with outward confidence, even if you're not really feeling it inside. I'm Amy Newmark. Thanks for joining me today. If you want to read more easy tips from my new book, Simply Happy, you'll find it at Walmart, Rite Aid, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, and all the other wonderful places that books are sold.